The day my
You are no
husband
longer my
told me I
wife.
was no
No,
longer his
please, what
wife,
are you saying?
he
I
was
smell
standing in
another
front of
woman's
my
perfume
mother's
on you.
house
This can't be
with another
happening.
woman's
I can
perfume on
explain.
his
Don't do
shirt
this.
and
It is
my
done.
family's keys in his pocket. He said it loudly, too. Loud enough for the driver unloading suitcases from the back of his SUV to freeze. Loud enough for the woman beside him to smile like she had finally won something she had been stealing in pieces for months. Loud enough for his mother, sitting on my mother's veranda with a glass of cold hibiscus juice in her hand, to lean back and enjoy the show like she had paid for front row seats. And loud enough for me to realize that everything I had been excusing, minimizing, forgiving, and surviving in that marriage had finally reached its true name. I had driven almost 4 hours to that house, after Richard, the groundskeeper who had worked for my family since before I was born, called me with one sentence that turned my blood cold. "Madam Mary, your husband is here, with trucks." At first, I thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe he was picking up documents. Maybe one of his clients wanted to use the property for a weekend event. But by the time I turned into the gravel drive and saw the open trunks, the stacked suitcases, the boxes of wine, and that woman standing under my mother's bougainvillea arch like she belonged there, I understood exactly what was happening. My husband, David Badu, had not come to visit. He had come to take over. And the woman beside him, Patricia, his business partner, his assistant, his mistress, whatever title she had earned for herself in the demolition of my marriage, was already dressed for it. White linen trousers, gold sandals, dark sunglasses, one hand on her hip. The kind of smile women wear when they think the wife is the last person to get the news. Then David looked at me slowly, like I was the inconvenience. And he said, "Mary, stop making scenes. You're not my wife anymore." If you have ever had someone speak to you like your loyalty was a small thing, stay with me. Because what happened after that sentence was not what any of them expected. And before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because tonight's story starts with humiliation and ends with a locked gate, a broken plan, and a woman remembering exactly who she was before a man tried to rename her. My name is Mary Mensa Badu, though by the end of that day I stopped hearing his surname as if it belonged on me. I was born Mary Mensa, the only daughter of Joseph and Linda Mensa, and the house David tried to claim sat on the quiet eastern edge of Lake Volta, where the water turns silver before sunset and the wind carries the smell of wet earth and old memory. People called it a house. To my family, it was a witness. My grandfather bought that land when people said the shoreline was useless. He bought it anyway because my grandmother said the water made her sleep deeply. My mother added the wide front veranda. My father planted almond trees along the drive and a flame tree near the dock because he said every home needed at least one thing that bloomed like it had nothing to prove. I learned to swim there. I learned to read there. I learned what grief sounded like there after my mother died. Some people inherit valuables. I inherited a place that knew my entire life. Everything in that house had a history. That is why David hated it from the beginning. Not openly at first. Men like David do not always insult the things you love directly. First, they reduce them. They call your memories inefficient. They call your boundaries emotional. They call your inheritance underutilized. They call your traditions charming, with a tone that means temporary. When David first visited the house, he stood on the veranda with both hands in his pockets and said, "This place has potential. Not beauty, not warmth, not soul. Potential." I should have heard the warning hidden inside that word, but back then I was still in love with the polished version of him, the attentive version, the version that knew how to tilt his head when I spoke and how to appear respectful around my parents. David came from a family that worshipped image. His mother, Jennifer Badu, believed class was a performance and morality was negotiable as long as the curtains were expensive. David had been raised to want what impressed other people, not what was good, what was visible. I met him when I was 29 and working in community finance for a women's cooperative network. My job was not glamorous, but it mattered. We helped women secure fair lending, inventory support, and protection from predatory contracts. David told me that was one of the things he admired about me. "You care about people no one else notices," he said on our 4th date. Years later, he would use that same quality as an insult. "You make everything heavy with other people's problems," he snapped one night when I challenged him for mocking a market vendor. That is how disrespect grows in some marriages. Not like fire, like mold. Quiet, spreading, always one corner ahead of where you are looking. At the beginning, he was careful. Flowers to my office, voice notes when he traveled, public affection, good manners in front of my family. If you had looked at us then, you would have seen exactly what I saw. A man who seemed disciplined, intelligent, ambitious, and sure of me. We married by the lake in a small ceremony under white fabric and hanging lights. My father cried during the vows. My mother's portrait stood beside the front steps because she had passed 3 years earlier, and I could not bear beginning a new chapter without leaving some visible place for the woman who taught me how to survive sorrow with dignity. After the ceremony, my father stood with me near the dock and watched David laughing with his friends on the lawn. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than I understood. A woman should never marry a man who looks at a home and only sees what can be extracted from it. I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. He kissed my forehead and said, "No, I am being older than you." My father died 6 years later. By then, the marriage had changed its shape. David had stopped trying to impress me and started trying to manage me. He criticized the time I spent with my aunties. He rolled his eyes when I talked about the cooperative. He corrected me in public with that quiet, clever tone some men use when they want to humiliate a woman without losing the room. He called my work soft. He called my values impractical. He called my refusal to sell the lakehouse sentimental. And his mother helped. Jennifer never liked that the house remained in my name. She disliked the fact that I had one thing in life that did not pass through her son's approval. The first time she raised the subject openly was at dinner in our home in Accra. She dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin and said, "I still find it strange that the lakehouse was not folded into the marital estate. It would be cleaner that way." I put down my fork and said, "It was left to me by my parents." She smiled the way women smile when they are preparing to say something ugly in a voice too elegant to challenge. "Yes, dear, but marriage means sharing. My family shared it with me. That was the decision." David sighed immediately, as if I had created tension rather than defended myself. "That's not what my mother meant," he said. "It always worked like that." She cut. He translated the bleeding. Over time, he became more interested in the property. He asked strange questions. Did the deed allow leasing? Could the dock be expanded? Had my father discussed commercial partnerships? Was the shoreline permitted for private mooring? He framed every question as practical curiosity. He worked in development strategy by then and constantly talked about investors, acquisitions, resort models, land optimization. At first, I only found it boring. Later, I would understand it was never casual. The affair entered my marriage the same way everything corrosive entered it, gradually enough for denial to survive. Patricia joined David's firm as a project coordinator. She was smart, stylish, and very aware of angles. The first time I met her, she touched David's sleeve before she greeted me. A tiny thing, almost nothing. But women notice ownership in gestures long before men admit betrayal in words. She smiled and said, "I've heard so much about you." I said, "I hope the version you heard had my full name and not just my husband's summary." She laughed too brightly. David looked annoyed. After that, Patricia became a regular presence in his speech before she became a regular presence in his life. Then it became late meetings, weekend calls, work travel with missing details, new cologne, hidden screens, sudden irritation whenever I entered a room while he was texting. The proof arrived one Sunday evening. David told me he had to pick up files from the office. He said no too quickly when I suggested coming along, so I waited 10 minutes, then drove there anyway. His car was parked behind the building. Patricia's was parked beside it. The lights on the second floor were off. I sat in my car across the road for 19 minutes. When they finally came out, he had one hand pressed lightly against the middle of her back, the exact place men touch women they no longer need to hide from in their own minds. I did not follow them. I did not scream. I did not call. I went home and sat at my dining table in silence until he returned carrying takeaway food and excuses he had not yet realized I no longer needed to hear. When I asked him directly, he did not deny it for long. "Do you want honesty, Mary, or do you want theater?" he asked. That sentence told me everything. A faithful man does not ask like that. An innocent man does not sound inconvenienced by truth. He admitted there was something between them. He blamed distance. He blamed my work. He blamed my sadness after my father's death, as if grief were infidelity's natural alibi. He said I lived too much in memory. He said Patricia made him feel seen. I remember looking at him and thinking, there it is. The moment the person you married stops sounding like the person you would have chosen. The next morning, he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, as if betrayal were an argument we could schedule properly after coffee. That was the day I called a lawyer. Her name was Jessica Adamaco. She was one of those women whose calmness makes dangerous people careless. I told her everything, and expected the conversation to stay within the boundaries of divorce. Instead, before I finished describing David's recent obsession with the lakehouse, she asked a question I did not expect. "Has anyone shown unusual interest in your shoreline access rights?" I frowned. Why would that matter? She folded her hands and said, "Because your husband's firm has been quietly tied to a private marina and luxury villa proposal near that side of the lake. And because one of the most valuable pieces in that puzzle is not just your house, it is the adjoining access corridor, the old service road, and the private dock permissions your father kept separate." Then she asked, "Have you read every page of your father's estate file?" I thought I had. I had not. That night, I opened the carved wooden chest where I kept my mother's letters, my father's wristwatch, old photographs, and the official documents I had not looked at in years, because grief can make even your own inheritance feel too sacred to handle casually. There, beneath the deed and the old survey maps, was the document that changed everything. My father had not simply left me the house. He had placed it, along with adjoining easements, shoreline rights, and a protected conservation strip, into the Mensa Family Holding Trust. I was the sole controlling trustee. No spouse, no claimant, No business partner, no marital estate petition could access, occupy, lease, develop, or represent that property in any commercial arrangement without my written authorization. Unauthorized entry after revocation could be treated as trespass. My father had not just given me a home. He had built a legal fence around it. At the very back of the file was a handwritten note in his careful block letters. Mary, if a person truly loves you, they will never need to weaken what protects you in order to stand beside you. I cried when I read that. Not because I felt broken, because I felt seen across time. Divorce began quietly after that. David filed first, because of course he did. He told people we had grown apart. He told others I had become difficult after losing my father. He said I was emotionally unstable and over-attached to inherited property that should have been modernized years ago. His mother made sympathetic calls to mutual friends. Patricia posted quotes online about choosing peace and refusing to apologize for happiness. I said nothing. Silence frightens loud liars, because silence often means preparation. For nearly 3 months we communicated through lawyers. Then, on a hot afternoon in August, Richard called. "Madam Mary, your husband is here with trucks." The drive to the lake felt unreal. By the time I reached the house, I was no longer shaking. That should have warned them. The gate was open. David's black SUV sat under the almond trees like it had arrived for ownership. Patricia's smaller white car was near the side path. 2 hired men were unloading boxes marked kitchen and patio. A set of expensive travel bags already stood by the front steps. On the veranda, Jennifer sat in one of my mother's cane chairs, sipping hibiscus juice from a glass I knew had belonged to my grandmother. That detail almost did it. Not the mistress, not the trucks, the glass. There is something about seeing disrespect touch your dead. Richard stood near the garden wall, arms folded, jaw tight. He had stayed because he knew I would not want witnesses gone when truth was about to crack open. David saw me first. He removed his sunglasses slowly. Patricia turned. Jennifer did not even bother to stand. "What are you doing here?" I asked. David smiled with the kind of patience men perform when they think they are about to explain your own life to you. "Using the house," he said. "No." He glanced at the movers as if I were embarrassing him in front of staff. "Mary, don't start." Patricia took a step closer and said, "It's just a few weeks. We needed somewhere quiet." Needed. The audacity of that word on my family's veranda. "Take your things," I said, "and leave." Jennifer laughed softly. "My dear, please don't turn this into another melodrama. David has every right to be comfortable while your lawyers sort out your bitterness." I looked at the glass in her hand and said, "Put that down." She blinked. The glass. It belonged to my grandmother. "Put it down." David stepped between us, lowering his voice into that false private tone he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "The papers are already in motion," he said. "You know where this is going. You're not my wife anymore." He said it loudly enough for everyone to hear, and something inside me went very still. Not shattered, still. Because there is a point in some betrayals where pain stops leading and clarity takes over. I looked at him, then at Patricia, then at his mother in my mother's chair, then at the men carrying boxes into a house none of them had the right to enter. I walked past David without another word. He grabbed my wrist. Not violently, not enough to bruise. Enough. Richard stepped forward immediately. "Sir," he said, and there was thunder in his voice. "Remove your hand." David let go. I climbed the steps, crossed the veranda, opened the front door with my key, went inside, and locked it behind me. For 3 seconds, nobody reacted. Then David laughed. Then he tried the handle. Then he knocked. Then he banged. "Mary, open this door." I stood in the front hall, breathing in old wood, lemon polish, lake air, and the sharp foreign note of Patricia's perfume. A suitcase had already been opened near the staircase. Someone had placed a cosmetics bag on my mother's side table. My father's framed photograph had been moved to make room for a decorative candle. My whole body went cold. I put the photograph back where it belonged. Then I walked to the study, took the landline, and called Richard. "Change every gate code now," I said. "Already started. Call Jessica." "On it." "And call the district police." There was a pause. Then he said, with satisfaction he did not hide, "Yes, madam." Outside, David kept pounding. "Mary, stop this nonsense." But the moment he called it nonsense, I knew I had already won the psychological part of it. Because entitled people only call your boundaries irrational when they thought access was already theirs. I disabled every guest code in the house. Then I locked the dock gate. Then I sent one message to Jessica. He entered with Patricia, Jennifer, movers, and luggage. "I have revoked permission. Proceed." When I returned to the window beside the door, Patricia had removed her sunglasses. She no longer looked elegant. She looked uncertain. Affairs are exciting until property law arrives. I opened the side window just a few inches. "Unlock the door," David snapped. "No." His face changed. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean you have 10 minutes to remove every person and every item from this property before the police arrive." Jennifer stood so abruptly the cushion slipped. "Police?" she repeated. "Have you lost your mind?" I looked at her evenly. "You entered private property without permission and sat in my mother's chair drinking from my grandmother's glass. If you would like me to keep going, I can." Patricia folded her arms. "This is pathetic." I turned to her. "If you say one more word from my veranda, I'll make sure your name appears in the formal complaint as well." She went silent. David tried another tactic. Softer voice, tight jaw. "Mary, we can discuss this privately." "No. You are making this ugly." "No. You brought ugly here in boxes." That landed. He lowered his voice further. "This house was used during our marriage. You cannot lock me out of what was part of our life." I smiled for the first time that day. A man should be very careful before publicly declaring, "I am no longer his wife," while privately trying to claim my family's property through that same marriage. His expression changed then. Fear had entered the room. The police arrived 19 minutes later. 2 officers, 1 local inspector, and Jessica's clerk, carrying copies of the trust documents, because Jessica herself was on the road from Accra. Richard met them at the gate and walked them up the drive. The movers stopped pretending not to listen. Jennifer called someone on her phone in clipped outrage. Patricia had stepped off the veranda completely by then. Inspector Thomas listened to David for less than a minute before holding up one hand and asking a single question. "Do you have written authorization from the controlling trustee to occupy this property?" David began to answer like a businessman. Inspector Thomas repeated, "That is a yes or no question." David said, "No." The inspector nodded and took the document packet from Jessica's clerk. Jennifer stepped in then, outraged and elegant. "This is a family misunderstanding," she said. "Surely we don't need this level of embarrassment." The inspector looked at her and said, "Madam, trespass is not reduced by better handbags." Richard almost smiled. David's face hardened. "This is my wife." "Correction," I said through the window. "You made a very public point of saying, 'I am not.'" The inspector scanned the highlighted clauses and asked David and his guests to remove their belongings immediately. He informed them that refusal would escalate the situation. The movers did not need further encouragement. They began carrying everything back to the truck with the speed of men who did not want their names connected to rich people behaving badly. Patricia tried one last performance. "I never meant to disrespect you." I looked straight at her and said, "You walked into another woman's family home with luggage. Let us not insult each other by pretending confusion." Her face lost color. Jennifer muttered something about vindictive women. I answered without raising my voice. "No. Vindictive women do damage. I am doing documentation." Even Inspector Thomas looked like he wanted to laugh. David asked to speak to me alone. I refused. He said I would regret humiliating him. I said the only thing I regretted was giving him a key years ago because I mistook marriage for safety. Because that was the truth beneath everything. I had not been defeated. I had been too generous with access. When the last box was removed and the trucks rolled back toward the gate, the house seemed to breathe again. I stepped outside only after the vehicles had gone. The late afternoon light was turning gold over the water. Richard stood at the edge of the steps. Inspector Thomas handed me a copy of the incident report. Jessica's clerk promised full follow-up by morning. Then they all left. And for the first time that day, the silence belonged to me. I went room by room through the house. I wiped the kitchen counters. I put my mother's cushion back where Jennifer had flattened it. I washed the glass she used and put it away carefully. I picked up a silk scarf Patricia had left draped over the banister and dropped it straight into a refuse bag. Then I sat on the veranda, in the chair my mother used to claim every evening at dusk, and let myself cry. Not because I wanted David back. That grief had already changed form. I cried because there is something devastating about realizing a person you once trusted was willing to step into your most sacred place and treat it like overflow storage for his appetite. That night, David called me 12 times. I did not answer. His mother sent a message saying I had disgraced the family. I replied, "Which family?" By morning, Jessica had already moved. She filed a formal notice of unauthorized entry, requested immediate restrictions against any further access attempts, and responded to David's lawyer, who had the nerve to suggest the confrontation resulted from emotional instability on my part. Her reply was magnificent. She attached the trust provisions, the incident report, the gate logs, photos of the luggage, and a line that still makes me smile. "Your client appears to have mistaken prior marriage for permanent permission." David made noise after that. He told people I had overreacted. He said Patricia had only been helping him recover personal items. He claimed his mother had gone there for peace. He told anyone who would listen that I was weaponizing inheritance because I could not accept the end of the marriage gracefully. Gracefully. That word again. Women are always expected to leave gracefully when men have finished using their patience. But something had changed in me after the lockout. Not just emotionally, structurally. I stopped organizing my life around recovery and started organizing it around truth. That was when the bigger picture opened fully. David's firm, along with outside investors, had been working on a high-end waterfront development proposal disguised as eco-luxury revitalization. Boutique villas, private marina slips, exclusive dining, controlled lake access, beautiful brochures, destructive consequences. The proposal depended on securing a continuous access corridor along the eastern edge of the shoreline, including use of service roads, maintenance easements, and dock permissions tied to family-owned parcels around my house. And my father, without telling many people, had spent 22 years quietly acquiring and protecting several of those parcels through the trust. Not as an empire, as a defense. He had seen what happened when wealthy developers came smiling into places built by ordinary people. Fishermen pushed out, families priced off ancestral land, public access reduced, promises made in polished English and broken in silence. My father had not fought loudly. He had prepared quietly. And now David, the man who mocked old wood and family memory, had married himself almost into the center of a structure he thought he could eventually pry open. It had never just been about adultery. It had never just been about ego. He wanted leverage. That knowledge rearranged something in me. Betrayal hurts, but calculated betrayal clarifies. Suddenly, every question he had asked over the years about permit boundaries, title categories, leasing rights, and access roads stood up and confessed all at once. He had not merely wanted my house. He had wanted my father's map. I spent the next 6 weeks learning everything he had hoped I would stay too heartbroken to understand. Survey files, boundary history, water access restrictions, conservation covenants, title maps, public use agreements. I walked the land with Richard at sunrise. I met elders who remembered my grandfather. I met women who sold smoked fish and told me which developers had already been sniffing around, promising prosperity with one hand and pushing displacement with the other. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not wild anger, useful anger, the kind that sharpens. The county review hearing took place in October. David did not know I would be there officially as controlling trustee. He assumed I would stay where men like him prefer women after a divorce. Wounded, private, and too embarrassed to interfere. He arrived in a navy suit with Patricia beside him, and Jennifer seated in the second row wearing pearls and disapproval. On easels near the front were glossy renderings of the proposed development. Sunlit decks, smiling couples, clean white villas, boats on shining water. The usual fantasy. No fishermen, no old families, no women selling grilled tilapia by the roadside. When public comment opened, a few businessmen spoke first. Jobs, growth, investment, visibility. You can do a lot of damage to a place under the banner of opportunity if you never ask opportunity for whom. Then local residents stood and spoke about access, flooding, and the burial ground near one of the parcels targeted for road widening. Then Richard stood up. He said only this: "Some land is old enough to remember the names of the people who cared for it. That memory should count for something." And then I stood. David saw me, and all the blood seemed to leave his face at once. I walked to the microphone in a cream dress my mother once had tailored for me years ago, and a pair of flat sandals because I was not there to perform elegance. I was there to block theft in broad daylight. My name is Mary Mensa. I am the controlling trustee of the Mensa Family Holding Trust, which governs several of the shoreline parcels, access routes, and easements materially implicated in the development proposal under review. The room changed. You can feel it when truth enters a room wearing the right paperwork. I stated for the record that the trust did not authorize any use, negotiation, access assumption, representation, development support, or corridor reliance connected to the proposed project. I outlined the community usage patterns my father had protected. I challenged the misleading environmental framing in the submission. I explained that public-facing language about revitalization concealed privatization through layered control of shoreline movement. David stared at me like he had never seen me before. Maybe he had not. Because for years, I had been reducing myself in rooms where his confidence was louder than my knowledge. That day, I remembered something men like him hate. A quiet woman who finally decides to use her full mind. After the hearing, he followed me into the corridor. "You've made your point," he said. "No, I've stated my position. This project could transform the area." I looked him dead in the eyes. "Then transform somewhere that belongs to you." His jaw tightened. "This is personal." "No," I said. "You made it personal when you brought your mistress to my mother's house. This is structural." That line broke him more than anger would have. Because anger he could dismiss. Precision terrified him. The project did not die immediately. Men with money rarely surrender after one humiliation. But it started bleeding. Investors became nervous once they realized the trust parcels were unavailable. Additional environmental review was ordered. Local opposition organized more forcefully. Reporters began asking better questions. Then came the article that finished the public illusion. A journalist from Accra connected the attempted occupation of my lakehouse to the wider development strategy. She interviewed residents, reviewed trust filings, and exposed the access assumptions buried under the glamorous marketing language. He tried to take her family home. He also wanted the shoreline behind it. After that, David's firm distanced itself carefully, not morally, strategically. Patricia took sudden leave. Jennifer stopped calling mutual friends to complain. Truth does that. It ruins gossip by giving it context. The divorce settlement came 6 months later. Clean, efficient, unsentimental. David kept the city apartment. I kept what had always been mine. More importantly, I kept my name clear of his narrative. A few weeks after the settlement, he came to the lakehouse one last time. He did not get past the gate. The new security system had already flagged his vehicle to my phone. Richard asked if I wanted him sent away. I said no. Then I walked down to the gate myself. David stood on the other side of the black iron bars, looking older than I remembered, though not by years, by failure. There was no Patricia, no Jennifer, no audience, just him. "I lost the project," he said. "I know. I may lose more than that." I said nothing. Then he asked the question I think had been eating at him for months. "Did you always know I was trying to use you?" I looked at him for a long second before answering. "No. If I had known, I would have left sooner." He lowered his eyes. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes," I replied. Then he said something almost honest. "That house made me feel like there was a whole part of you I could never reach." I held his gaze. That is because love does not grant ownership of everything sacred, I said. And you never learned the difference. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was no cleverness left, no performance. Just a man standing outside a gate he had mistaken for temporary. I did love you, he said. I believed he did. In the limited, hungry, self-serving way some men love. Enough to want you, never enough to protect you from themselves. I know, I said. But you loved access more. That was the last real conversation we ever had. The following year, I restructured the Trust's public use commitments with help from Jessica, Richard, local planners, and community leaders. We restored the old public lakeside bank my father had always protected informally. We repaired the smaller dock. We created a legal usage pathway for local families and a stewardship fund for maintenance. We turned one of the outbuildings into a reading room and training center for women running lakeside businesses, named after my mother, Linda Mensa, because she believed women should always know the numbers behind anything men expected them to simply sign. On opening day, children ran across the lawn. Women from the cooperatives brought food. Old men argued over fish stories near the water. Richard wore a pressed shirt and tried very hard not to look proud, which of course made him look even prouder. I hung my mother's photograph in the reading room and placed my father's handwritten note in a frame by the entrance. If a person truly loves you, they will never need to weaken what protects you in order to stand beside you. Sometimes I stand on the veranda in the evening and think about the sentence David threw at me that afternoon. You're not my wife anymore. At the time, he meant it as erasure. But some sentences become freedom by accident. He thought he was reducing me. What he really did was release me from the last obligation to keep explaining my value to a man committed to misunderstanding it. He thought he was ending my place in his life. Instead, he ended his place in mine. He thought the lock on that door was cruelty. It was correction. People often ask whether I regret humiliating him. I tell them no. I regret every year before that when I was so busy preserving peace that I ignored the cost of my own silence. I regret translating disrespect into stress, selfishness into ambition, control into masculinity, and betrayal into confusion. But I do not regret the day I turned the key, because that day did not only save a house, it saved a shoreline. It saved my parents' work. It saved a future David had no right to script on top of my family's memory. And most of all, it saved me from becoming one more woman who mistakes endurance for love and access for intimacy. If someone in your life keeps asking you to prove your love by giving up the things that protect your dignity, your peace, your inheritance, your voice, or your boundaries, listen carefully to me. That is not love asking. That is appetite. And appetite is never satisfied by generosity. It only becomes more educated. Some people do not understand value until permission is gone. Some people do not respect the house until the locks are changed. Some people do not believe a woman is serious until she stops arguing and starts documenting. David learned all of that too late. The gate is still there. The code is still changed. The house is still standing. And every evening, when the light turns gold over the lake and the veranda fills with that soft, old quiet my mother loved, I thank God for one thing I never thought I would say. I am grateful he said I was not his wife anymore, because that was the day I became fully my own again.